The morning mist clung to the valley like the breath of dying gods, and Commander Marcus Aurelius Blackthorne knew that death rode with the dawn. From his position atop the ancient watchtower of Shadowmere Keep, he could see them, thousands upon thousands of dark figures moving like a plague across the landscape. The Shadow Legion had finally come. It was the 15th day of September, 1873, and the world stood at the precipice of its darkest hour. The enemy had been marching for weeks, their black banners bearing the twisted sigil of the Crimson Eclipse, symbol that had haunted the nightmares of every soldier who had witnessed their previous conquests. Cities had fallen before them like wheat before the scythe, and now they had come for the last bastion of the free world. According to historical records from the Royal War Archives, the Shadow Legion numbered nearly 50,000 strong, composed of battle-hardened veterans from the fallen kingdoms of Velthorn, Dregmor, and the Northern Wastes. They were led by the infamous General Malak, a man whose very name had become synonymous with terror across the known world. His tactical brilliance was matched only by his cruelty, and his army moved with the precision of a well-oiled machine of destruction. Blackthorne turned from the window and faced his assembled war council. The faces before him were grim but resolute. These were men and women who had chosen to stand against the darkness, knowing full well that they might not see another sunrise. Lord Admiral Winston Stormwind, veteran of the Siege of Ironhold, sat with his weathered hands folded before him. Beside him, Lady General Seraphina Liebringer, the legendary strategist who had never lost a battle, studied the maps with intense concentration. "The enemy will reach our outer defenses by nightfall," Blackthorne announced, his voice carrying the weight of command. "They outnumber us 3-1, and their siege engines are the most advanced we've ever encountered. But we have something they don't. We fight for our homes, our families, and our freedom." The room fell silent as the gravity of their situation settled over them like a shroud. They were the last hope of the Allied kingdoms, the final barrier between the Shadow Legion and total domination. The fortress of Shadowmere Keep had been hastily fortified over the past month, its ancient walls reinforced with modern artillery and defensive positions. But would it be enough? Young Captain Theodore Brown, barely 25 years old but already a decorated hero of the Battle of Crimson Ridge, spoke up from the back of the room. "Sir, what of the reinforcements from the Eastern Are they still expected to arrive?" Blackthorne's expression darkened. "The messenger ravens brought word this morning. The Eastern Army has been delayed by unexpected flooding. We stand alone." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of war drums echoing across the valley, the Shadow Legion's ominous announcement of their arrival. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of blood and gold, the defenders of Shadowmere Keep prepared for what many believed would be their final battle. The fate of the world hung in the balance, and the coming night would determine whether light or darkness would reign supreme. The attack came with the fury of 1,000 thunderstorms. As the clock tower of Shadowmere Keep chimed midnight on September 6, 1873, the darkness itself seemed to come alive with the sounds of war. The Shadow Legion's siege engines, massive constructs of iron and malice, hurled flaming projectiles over the fortress walls, while their infantry advanced under cover of darkness. General Malaka Voidheart had positioned his forces with masterful precision. His heavy cavalry, known as the Death Riders, formed the center of his assault, their black armor gleaming in the firelight like beetle shells. On the flanks, the dreaded Shadow Archers rained down arrows that seemed to drink in the light itself. But it was the Voidwalker's elite soldiers who seemed to move through shadows as if they were doorways, struck fear into the hearts of even the bravest defenders. Commander Blackthorne stood upon the battlements, his sword gleaming in the torchlight as he rallied his men. "Hold the line," he roared over the chaos. "Every second we delay them is another second for our people to escape to safety." His words carried across the fortress, inspiring courage in hearts that had nearly given way to despair. The first wave crashed against the fortress walls like a dark tide. Scaling ladders appeared as if from nowhere, and the defenders found themselves engaged in brutal hand-to-hand combat. Lord Admiral Stormwind led the defense of the Eastern War, his cutlass singing as it cut through enemy ranks. His naval experience proved invaluable as he coordinated the fortress's defensive artillery with the precision of his ships, captain directing cannon fire. Lady General Lightbringer had positioned herself at the fortress's most vulnerable point, the main gate. Her tactical genius became evident as she deployed her forces in a series of strategic withdrawals, each one designed to draw the enemy deeper into prepared kill zones. The Shadow Legion's superior numbers, nothing when they were funneled into narrow corridors where the defenders could fight them on equal terms. According to battlefield reports later compiled by the Royal Military Academy, the fighting was some of the most intense ever recorded. Captain Brightblade distinguished himself by leading a daring sortie that destroyed 3 of the enemy's siege engines, but at a terrible cost. Half of his men fell in the assault, and he himself sustained severe wounds that would have killed a lesser man. As dawn approached, the first assault began to falter. The Shadow Legion had expected to overwhelm the fortress quickly, but they had underestimated the determination of its defenders. Bodies littered the ground before the walls, and the moat ran red with blood. Yet General Voidheart showed no signs of retreat. Instead, he began preparations for an even more devastating second assault. The brief respite allowed the defenders to tend to their wounded and assess their losses. Nearly a quarter of their force had fallen, including many of their most experienced officers. Commander Blackthorn walked among the wounded, offering words of encouragement and ensuring that every man knew his sacrifice was not in vain. But as the sun climbed higher, a new horror became apparent. The Shadow Legion's shamans had begun a dark ritual, and the very air around the fortress began to thicken with malevolent energy. The second assault would not rely on conventional weapons. Alone, General Voidheart intended to unleash the full power of the Shadow Realm itself. The defenders watched in growing dread as the sky above began to darken. Despite the morning sun, the battle for Shadowmere Keep was far from over, and the worst was yet to come. The 17th day of September 8 would forever be remembered as the day the very fabric of reality began to tear. As the Shadow Legion's dark shamans completed their forbidden ritual, the sky above Shadowmere Keep split open like a festering wound, revealing glimpses of the Shadow Realm beyond. From this tear in the world, creatures of nightmare began to pour forth beings that had no place in the world of light and life. Commander Blackthorn felt the temperature drop as supernatural cold swept across the battlefield. The horses in the fortress stables screamed in terror, and even the bravest soldiers felt their courage waver as they beheld the abominations that emerged from the rift. Shadow wraiths, beings of pure darkness that could pass through solid stone, began to infiltrate the fortress walls. Behind them came the Bone Crusher's massive skeletal warriors that stood twice the height of a man and wielded weapons forged from the bones of fallen heroes. General Voidheart himself had changed during the ritual. No longer entirely human, he stood at the center of his army wreathed in shadow, his eyes burning with otherworldly fire. His voice, when it rang out across the battlefield, seemed to come from the depths of the abyss itself. "Surrender now, and I will grant you the mercy of a quick death. Continue to resist, and I will feed your souls to the darkness for all eternity." The response came not from Commander Black, but from Lady General Lightbringer, whose voice carried clearly across the battlefield despite the supernatural chaos. "We have faced darkness before, and we have always found a way to kindle the light. Today will be no different." The second assault began not with a clash of steel, but with the screams of the damned. The Shadow Wraiths struck first, phasing through the fortress walls to attack the defenders from within. Regular weapons proved useless against these creatures of pure shadow, but the fortress's chaplain, Father Benedict, had prepared blessed weapons and holy water. The few soldiers equipped with these consecrated arms found they could strike at the wraiths, though at great personal cost. Each blow drained their life force. Captain Brightblade, despite his wounds from the previous night, led a desperate charge against the Bone Crushers that had breached the outer courtyard. His blessed sword, inherited from his grandfather who had fought in the War of the Crimson Dawn, blazed with holy light as it cut through the undead monstrosities. But for every creature he felled, two more seemed to take its place. Lord Admiral Stormwind found himself facing an enemy unlike any he had encountered in his decades of naval warfare. The Shadow Legion's Marines, enhanced by dark magic, could scale walls as easily as walking on level ground. His defensive positions, so effective against conventional assault, proved inadequate against enemies who could attack from any angle. He was forced to adapt his tactics constantly, turning the fortress's interior into a maze of defensive positions. Historical accounts from the Church of the Eternal Light describe the battle as taking on an almost mythical quality. The line between the physical and spiritual worlds had become blurred, and the defenders found themselves fighting not just for their lives, but for their very souls. Some soldiers reported seeing the ghosts of fallen comrades fighting alongside them, while others claimed to witness angels descending from above to aid in their struggle. As the day wore on, the situation became increasingly desperate. The Shadow Realm creatures proved nearly impossible to kill permanently, and the defenders' ammunition and blessed weapons were running low. Commander Blackthorn realized that conventional tactics would not be sufficient to win this battle. Something more drastic was required. In the fortress's ancient library, scholars had discovered references to a legendary weapon, the Blade of Eternal Dawn, said to have been forged by the gods themselves during the first battle between light and darkness. According to the texts, it lay hidden somewhere within the fortress's deepest vaults, waiting for the hour of greatest need. As the sun began to set on what might be their final day, Blackthorn made a decision that would change the course of the battle. The catacombs beneath Shadowmere Keep had not been explored for over 2 centuries, and with good reason. The ancient passages, carved from living rock by the fortress's original builders, were said to be haunted by the spirits of those who had died defending the realm in ages past. As Commander Blackthorn descended into the darkness with a small team of volunteers, he could feel the weight of history pressing down upon him like a physical force. The expedition consisted of only 5 men: Blackthorn himself, Captain Brightblade despite his wounds, Father Benedict with his knowledge of ancient lore, Master Sergeant Ironhand, Grimborder, veteran of countless battles, and young Private Samuel Lightfoot, whose small stature made him ideal for navigating the narrow passages. Each man carried a blessed torch, for they had learned that ordinary fire provided little protection against the creatures of shadow. According to the ancient texts preserved in the royal archives, The blade of eternal dawn had been hidden during the Age of Shadows over 1,000 years ago. The weapon was said to be capable of cutting through the very fabric of darkness itself, making it the perfect weapon against the Shadow Legion's otherworldly allies. But the texts also warned of terrible guardians that protected the blade, tests that would challenge not only their courage but their very souls. The first chamber they entered was filled with the bones of previous seekers, their armor and weapons corroded by time and something far more sinister. Strange symbols covered the walls, pulsing with a faint, sickly light. Father Benedict studied them carefully, his face growing pale as he translated the ancient warnings. "These speak of trials," he whispered. "3 tests must be passed: the trial of courage, the trial of sacrifice, and the trial of truth." The trial of courage came first, manifesting as a massive chamber filled with illusions designed to exploit each man's deepest fears. Captain Brightblade faced the specter of his fallen comrades, their accusing voices claiming he had led them to their deaths. Master Sergeant Grimboard confronted the memory of a battle where he had been forced to abandon wounded soldiers to save the greater force. Each man had to overcome not just external threats, but the darkness within their own hearts. Private Lightfoot surprised everyone by being the first to complete his trial. The young soldier faced his fear of being forgotten, of dying meaninglessly in battle, but he found strength in the knowledge that his sacrifice would protect others, and the illusions dissolved before his newfound resolve. The trial of sacrifice demanded that one among them give up something precious to proceed. The ancient mechanism required a willing offering of that which they valued most. Captain Brightblade stepped forward without hesitation, placing his grandfather's blessed sword, his most treasured possession, into the altar's waiting receptacle. The blade vanished in a flash of light, and the way forward opened. The final trial, the trial of truth, forced each man to confront the reality of their situation. They were shown visions of the battle above, witnessing the steadily worsening situation. The Shadow Legion's forces were overwhelming the remaining defenders, and it seemed impossible that they could hold out much longer. Some of the men began to despair, questioning whether their quest was already too late. But Commander Blackthorn stood firm. "Even if we fail," he declared, "even if we all die here, we will have died trying to save our people. That is worth any sacrifice." His words rekindled hope in the others, and the final chamber opened before them. The blade of eternal dawn hung suspended in a shaft of pure light, its surface gleaming like captured starlight. The weapon seemed to sing as Blackthorn approached, and when his fingers closed around its hilt, power beyond imagination coursed through his veins. The blade itself was a thing of beauty, its edge sharp enough to cut through reality itself, its surface inscribed with runes that spoke of justice, protection, and the eternal struggle between light and darkness. As they prepared to return to the surface, the sounds of battle grew louder. The fortress was clearly in its final hours, and they might already be too late. But the blade of eternal dawn pulsed with warm light, and Blackthorn knew that their darkest hour was also their greatest opportunity. The final confrontation between light and darkness was about to begin. The 18th day of September 18, when Commander Blackthorn and his small band emerged from the catacombs, they found Shadowmere Keep in its death throes. The Shadow Legion had breached the inner walls, and desperate hand-to-hand combat raged throughout the fortress courtyards. Bodies lay scattered like fallen leaves, and the very stones seemed to weep with the blood of heroes. Lady General Lightbringer met them at the top of the stairs, her uniform torn and bloodied but her spirit unbroken. "Thank the gods you've returned," she gasped. "We can't hold much longer. The Eastern Wall has fallen, and General Voidheart himself leads the assault on the keep's main hall." The blade of eternal dawn seemed to pulse with increasing intensity as they approached the center of the fighting. Its light cut through the supernatural darkness that had settled over the fortress, and for the first time in hours, the defenders could see clearly. Hope began to kindle in hearts that had nearly given way to despair. Lord Admiral Stormwind had barricaded himself and the remaining defenders in the Great Hall, using overturned tables and debris to create a final defensive position. His naval cutlass dripped with the black ichor of shadow creatures, and his eyes held the fierce light of a man who had accepted death but refused to surrender. "Blackthorn," he called out, "whatever you found down there, I hope it's enough. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they break through." The great doors of the hall exploded inward as General Voidheart himself entered. No longer entirely human but transformed into something far more terrible. His body was wreathed in shadow and flame, his eyes burning with the cold fire of the void. Behind him came his elite guard, the Death Knights, warriors who had sold their souls for power and now served as his personal executioners. "So," Voidheart's voice echoed with supernatural resonance, "the last rats choose to die in their hole. How fitting." His gaze fell upon the blade of eternal dawn, and for the first time, something like concern flickered across his inhuman features. "You've found it, haven't you, the old king's toy? It matters not. The Age of Light is ending, and no ancient relic can stop what has already begun." The battle that followed would be remembered in song and story for generations to come. Commander Blackthorn raised the blade of eternal dawn, and its light blazed forth like a second sun. The Shadow Legion's supernatural creatures recoiled, their forms beginning to waver and dissolve. But General Voidheart only laughed. raising his own weapon, a sword forged from crystallized darkness that seemed to drink in the light around it. The two commanders met in the center of the hall, their blades clashing with such force that the very air crackled with energy. Each strike sent shockwaves through the fortress, and the assembled armies fell back to give them room. This was no longer just a battle between armies, it was a confrontation between the fundamental forces of creation and destruction. Around them, the tide of battle began to turn. The blade of Eternal Dawn's light had weakened the Shadow Legion's supernatural allies, and the defenders pressed their advantage. Captain Brightblade, fighting with desperate courage despite his wounds, led a charge that shattered the Death Knight's formation. Master Sergeant Grimbert and Private Lightfoot fought back-to-back, their blessed weapons carving through the enemy ranks. But the outcome still hung in the balance. General Voidheart's power was immense, drawn from the very Shadow Realm itself. For every wound Blackthorn inflicted, the general seemed to grow stronger. The dark sword in his hands pulsed with malevolent energy, and with each clash, more of the hall's defenders fell to its corrupting influence. As the battle raged on, Blackthorn realized that strength alone would not be enough. The Blade of Eternal Dawn was not just a weapon, it was a symbol, a beacon of hope that drew its power from the faith and courage of those who stood against the darkness. He thought of all those who had died defending the light, all those who had sacrificed themselves for others, and felt their strength flowing into him. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the fate of the world hung on the edge of a blade forged from starlight and hope. The clash between light and darkness reached its crescendo, as the first rays of true dawn broke through the supernatural gloom that had Shadowmere Keep, their weapons singing with opposing energies that made the very air around them shimmer with power. The Blade of Eternal Dawn blazed with increasing intensity, fed by the sacrifice and courage of every defender who had fallen in the battle. General Voidheart's form began to waver as the light pressed against his shadowy essence. "You cannot defeat me," he snarled, his voice now more bestial than human. "I am eternal. I am the darkness that exists in every heart, the fear that haunts every dream." His blade of crystallized shadow struck out with desperate fury, seeking to extinguish the light that threatened to unmake him. But Blackthorn had learned something in the depths of the catacombs, something that the ancient texts had only hinted at. The Blade of Eternal Dawn was not just a weapon, it was a conduit, a means of channeling the collective will of all those who chose to stand against the darkness. As he fought, he could feel the spirits of the fallen fighting alongside him, their voices joining in a chorus of defiance that transcended death itself. The turning point came when Private Lightfoot, the youngest and seemingly least significant of the defenders, made a choice that would echo through history. Seeing his commander pressed to his limits, the young soldier threw himself between Blackthorn and Voidheart's killing stroke. The blade of darkness pierced his heart, but in that moment of ultimate sacrifice, something extraordinary happened. The light of the Blade of Eternal Dawn suddenly blazed forth with such intensity that it seemed to split the very fabric of reality. The rift in the sky above the fortress began to collapse, and the creatures of the Shadow Realm found themselves being drawn back into the void from which they had emerged. General Voidheart's scream of rage and despair shook the foundations of the keep as he felt his power being stripped away. Lady General Lightbringer later recorded in her battlefield report that what happened next defied all logical explanation. The Blade of Eternal Dawn seemed to multiply, its light spreading to touch every defender in the hall. Each man and woman found themselves wielding weapons of pure light, and the remaining Shadow Legion forces began to dissolve like mist before the morning sun. General Voidheart made one final desperate attempt to turn the tide, drawing upon the last reserves of his dark power. But the collective will of the defenders proved stronger than his malevolent force. Captain Brightblade, despite his grievous wounds, struck from the left. Master Sergeant Grimbord attacked from the right. Lord Admiral Stormwind pressed forward with unwavering determination. And at the center of it all, Commander Blackthorn raised the Blade of Eternal Dawn for the final strike. The blade pierced Voidheart's chest, and the general's form began to unravel. His last words were a promise of return, a vow that darkness would rise again. But as his essence scattered to the winds, the defenders knew that they had won something more than just a battle. No matter how overwhelming the odds, the aftermath was a scene of exhausted victory. The Shadow Legion's surviving forces fled in disarray, their supernatural allies banished back to the realm of nightmare. The fortress of Shadowmere Keep stood battered but unbroken, its walls bearing the scars of a battle that had shaken the very foundations of the world. As the sun climbed higher, painting the sky in shades of gold and hope, the defenders began to count their losses. Nearly half their number had fallen, including many of their bravest and best, but their sacrifice had not been in vain. The free world had been saved, and the light of civilization would continue to shine. Commander Blackthorn stood among the ruins of the Great Hall, the Blade of Eternal Dawn now dim but still warm in his hands. Around him, the surviving defenders began the long process of tending to their wounded and honoring their dead. The battle was over, but the memory of their stand against the darkness would live on forever. In the years that followed, bards and historians would sing of the Battle of Shadowmere Keep, of the night when a handful of heroes stood against the tide of darkness and refused to yield. Private Lightfoot was posthumously awarded the highest honors, his sacrifice remembered as the moment when the tide of battle turned. The Blade of Eternal Dawn was placed in the fortress's chapel, where it would serve as a reminder that even in the darkest hour, there is always hope. The Shadow Legion never rose again, but the lesson of their defeat was not forgotten. In every generation, there would be those who chose to stand against the darkness, who understood that freedom's price is eternal vigilance. The battle was won, but the war between light and darkness would continue as long as there were hearts brave enough to fight for what was right. The dawn had come, and with it, a new age of hope.